How many of you guys actually use lecture capture? How many of you use it? Most of you. Okay. Okay, good. Only one caveat. It's not for sale. Meaning, you can't download the darn thing, forward it to a pal of yours, and someone sells it out somewhere, okay? Not allowed. It's a criminal offense. Please remember that, okay? I know I'm joking, but it is a serious business because there are people who have tried in the past to actually download the stuff, get it across to information disseminators. So try not to do it, okay? No sales. Just download, read, but do whatever you have to do with it. Okay, right. We had two really good seminars yesterday. Everybody was participating. I was quite pleased. And I hope today we're going to have the same result. Good participation, understanding, and people have written things. So very good. Moving on, let's come back to the Syndicated Loan Agreement, the SLA. I walked you through conditions precedent, reps and warranties. And I think as I went along, I was trying to tie in the various aspects of the conflict of laws that we've talked through in the past, which will, as I kept on saying to you, come seeping in to our understanding of syndicated loans, bonds, etc. But now let's get on to what is most important to the bankers and the corporates who are active in this market, the financial terms. These are the things that I think lawyers tend to sleep through, but it's the most important part of the negotiations as far as the banks and the corporates, the borrowers are concerned, the financial terms. Let's just run through that. First of all, you see on that list the amount of the loan, the currency of the loan, the period of the loan, the most obvious things that you can think about. I'm not sure if I've got anything down there about it. Yeah, okay. The currency and amount of loan provisions will deal with the question whether the loan is whether the loan is a single currency loan or a multi-currency loan. As I said last week, generally speaking, they tend to be multi-currency, meaning the borrower has got the option to borrow in a range of currencies at its option. The thing about a multi-currency loan as distinct from a single currency loan is that if it's a multi-currency loan, you need to specify the amount that a borrower can borrow. So what happens in practice is that you've got two formats. You can either specify what amount someone may borrower can borrow in dollars, and what they can borrow in euros, and what they can borrow in yen, or whatever other currency that's the subject of the loan. That isn't particularly a popular format with borrowers in practice. What they prefer and usually get is a specification of the total amount of borrowings which can be outstanding at any one time, designated in dollars. So it's a dollarized total amount which can be drawn down, borrowed, in different currencies specified in the syndicated loan agreement. So you can draw down euros or yen or dollars or Singapore dollars or whatever that you want to borrow, and the total amount that's being borrowed cannot exceed, at any one time, the specified maximum amount in dollars in the syndicated loan agreement. Now that's easy to say when you think about it. You've got two issues which have to be dealt with immediately. One is, at what rate do you convert the currencies from yen into dollars to work out whether the borrower has exceeded the amount in dollars which the borrower could have borrowed? Well, the answer is the calculation is done on the basis of the time of borrowing and, importantly, ongoing calculation. So supposing the borrower takes 500 million in euros, the amount that the borrower may borrow is then looked at by converting the euros at the time of the borrowing into dollars, and then the total dollarized amount has to be looked at to see whether the borrower has exceeded the amount of borrowing that it is entitled to take out. Important point, however, is that ongoing, that euro 400 million that the borrower has borrowed will be converted into dollars at then dollar rates on an ongoing basis. So every interest payment date, for example, there would be another calculation of how much those euros which the borrower has taken amounts to in dollars. And of course, there are variations, fluctuations in currencies. You then come to the second problem, that what happens if the maximum has been exceeded? Not because the borrower has borrowed too much, but because there have been currency fluctuations. If, for example, the euro has strengthened strongly against the dollar, and the euros the borrower has borrowed in dollar terms, the dollar amounts are now much greater than the total amount, say, $1 billion that the borrower is entitled to borrow. What happens then? Well, a clause deals with the problem of currency fluctuations. How it does it is to provide for a margin of tolerance. In other words, the borrower shall not borrow in total, in all currencies, a maximum dollar amount of 1 billion, calculated at then prevailing exchange rates. If the total dollarized amount exceeds the maximum amount, the borrower shall repay such amounts as necessary to bring the borrowings below the maximum dollarized amount, subject to a 5 to 10% comfort zone of variation. So if you've got a 1 billion, if the comfort zone is 10%, quite high, you get 1 billion plus another 100 million in terms of currency fluctuations. So if it doesn't exceed 100 million in terms of currency fluctuations, the total amount outstanding will not trigger an obligation on the borrower's part to repay. But if it exceeds that 10% and it goes above 1,100 million due to currency fluctuations, then the borrower comes under an obligation to repay that amount. Okay, I know that's maths and that's terrible and it's really difficult to understand, blah, 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 but that's the structure of this clause which enables multi-currency borrowing up to a cap of 1 billion, 2 billion, whatever the number is. That's the mechanics of keeping that under control, because from the bank's point of view, they don't want their exposure, their risk to the borrower to keep on increasing on an ongoing basis. That's why the cap is there. Okay, so that's the second point. The third point about the currency of the loan is that while one is permitted to draw down, borrow, in different currencies, if amounts have been borrowed in specific currencies permitted in the syndicated loan agreement, then all repayments must be in the currency of borrowing. You borrow dollars, you pay dollars, you repay dollars. You borrow yen, you repay yen. You cannot say, oh, I borrowed dollars, but can I please repay in yen? No, you can't. So I think the rule is the currency of repayment must match the currency of borrowing. The reason why we have an express clause saying borrower shall repay all amounts in the currency of borrowing is that many law systems permit repayment in local currency. That's true of English law and New York law as well. To prevent that local rule from kicking in, you have a specific clause which says repayment shall be made in the currency of the original borrowing. Okay, next one. Interest rate payable on the borrowing. All syndicated loans, the interest is a floating rate. It's a variable rate. No syndicated loan is made on a fixed rate basis. It's always variable, what we call in the markets a floating rate. Now, the rate that's used is, right across the globe, it's called the LIBOR rate, the London Interbank Offered Rate, LIBOR. That's the benchmark rate that's used in the global market. Now, the syndicated loan agreement will require the borrower to pay interest at specified intervals, specified in the SLA, calculated by reference to LIBOR in relation to the particular currency in question, plus an additional margin, which is the profit margin for the banks. So it's LIBOR plus. So what has to be determined is what is LIBOR for dollars, what is LIBOR for yen, what's LIBOR for Singapore dollars, and so on. Whatever the borrower is borrowing, that currency's interest rate determined by LIBOR will be the interest rate which the borrower will need to pay on an ongoing basis. Next question. At what intervals is the borrower going to repay? Sorry, not repay, pay interest. On what basis is that going to happen? Well, that's determined by something called the interest rate fixing clause, which requires the borrower and the banks to agree an interest rate payable on the borrowing. And the interest rate payable varies from time to time. And we'll work out in a minute how that is determined. But before moving on to the interest rate fixing clause, LIBOR, something needs to be said about LIBOR. How many of you heard about the LIBOR rate fixing scandal? Gee whiz. No, never heard of it. Okay. The London Interbank Offered Rate is the LIBOR benchmark, the global benchmark for interest rates in 5 major transferable currencies. At any one time, LIBOR affects borrowings in total value of $450 trillion. So it's the major benchmark for interest rate calculation. LIBOR is set daily, not for the syndicated loan, but generally. It's done at 11 a.m. London time with 16 global banks, designated specified banks, submitting rates at which they borrow in each of 5 major currencies for periods of 1 month, 3 months, 6 months, 9 months, and 1 year. Those submissions are then averaged out and a rate determined for that currency for these periods, 1, 3 months, 6 months, 9 months. And this is done every day at 11 a.m. So the interest rate for 3 months today would not be the same as interest rate for 3 months in dollars tomorrow. Now, who's on the panel? The names of the banks who are involved, guess who they are. JP Morgan Chase, Deutsche Bank, HSBC, UBS, Mizuho, BNP Paribas, Crédit Agricole, Société Générale, and so on, the usual suspects. So that's how the LIBOR rate is set in the markets. But I think you need to know who organizes the whole thing. It's actually organized by Thomson Reuters. I mean, this is all background information for you. For something called ICE administration. It's not ICE as in the fridge. Intercontinental Exchanges is what ICE stands for. The IBA, the International Banking Association, will then post the LIBOR rates calculated by Thomson Reuters for ICE administration. I don't need to worry too much about who these people are. They tend to be a calculation done by essentially an independent group based on rates quoted by those 16 banks that I just put to you. Now, after the LIBOR scandal, I mean, gosh, it's only 5 years ago, and you guys never heard of it. Okay, you were in law school by then, wouldn't you? So 2013? Where were you guys? Where were you in law school? Could have been in school, for goodness sake, were you? Well, anyway, it doesn't matter. What happened, if you want to just get some background on it, is that the banks which were submitting quotes in 5 different currencies for 5 interest rate periods every day, and on the basis of those quotes, the LIBOR rate was being calculated were found to have been talking to each other and saying, hi guys, what rate shall we quote today? And they agreed rates, essentially rate fixing. And because of that, there's a huge amount of regulatory intervention because of the LIBOR rate fixing. And LIBOR is no longer done on that basis. Banks are supposed to say exactly what rate did you borrow at in these currencies, not what would you borrow at. In other words, it's a factual statement they've got to make now, since 2013. But because of all of these problems, LIBOR is being phased out. What's going to replace it? Nobody knows, as yet. The Americans have introduced for dollars something called the SOFR rate, the secured offering rate for dollars. As to whether that will catch on, that will become the standard rate for dollars, I don't know. But one thing is for certain, that the FCA, the Financial Conduct Authority in the UK, which actually oversees LIBOR, has said clearly, we're phasing it out. So within a year or so, hopefully, or maybe 2 years, people would have come up with a different calculation for how do you fix the global benchmark rates in different currencies for interest payments. Now, LIBOR has got its children. There's TIBOR, Tokyo Interbank Offered Rate. There's HIBOR, which is the Hong Kong Interbank Offered Rate. PIBOR, the Paris Interbank Offered Rate, and so on. The Milan Interbank Offered Rate, MIBOR, and so on. The whole pile of these, but these are smaller amounts that are involved in the fixing of interest. So, for example, if you wanted to, if you're a seriously nationalistic entity, and you wanted to say, no, I'm not going to go to LIBOR, that's London, I want the Paris Interbank Offered Rate, yeah, please have it. And you can put it in, and there is a rate that can be determined as to what is PIBOR. The problem is, for most banks, PIBOR doesn't have enough range of currencies on which you can get quotes, interest rate quotes. But anyway, that's a different story. But there it is, there are smaller calculation rates that are used in some jurisdictions. Now, as I said, come back to where I was. How is the interest rate to be fixed? I know it's better to LIBOR, but how? Who does it? Well, that's determined by what is called the interest rate fixed clause in the SLA. The borrower is required, under that clause, to request the lead manager, now called the agent bank, because after the syndicated loan agreement is signed, you will remember it becomes the agent bank, is required to request the lead manager for interest rate quotes in the currency in question, dollars or yen or whatever the currency is, for a period of time which the borrower chooses. Again, borrower's option. And the borrower's option is restricted to asking for quotes for 3 months, 6 months, 9 months, or 12 months. Okay. In practice, it's usually 3, 6, 9 rather than 12. The borrower will say, can I have an interest rate, please, LIBOR rate, for 3 months in yen? And then the interest rate clause requires the borrower to request a second fixing of interest rate at the end of the first period it has chosen. So let's say day one, syndicated loan agreement signed, conditions precedent satisfied, the borrower then says, I'd like to borrow $500 million in dollars. Give me an interest rate quote for 3 months in dollars. Agent bank will give the borrower a quote LIBOR plus the margin that the banks charge under the SLA terms. At the end of that 3 months, the borrower is required once again to ask the lead manager, agent bank, for another quote, interest rate quote, LIBOR quote, in relation to those dollars which it has borrowed. This time it can say, okay, give me a quote for 6 months. And the interest payable then is the interest rate, LIBOR rate, the 6-month LIBOR rate for the next 6 months. And at the end of that, the borrower can decide, well, give me an interest rate quote for 3 months, dollars, and so on. So this is a rolling process. That's why the interest rate that's referred to in a syndicated loan agreement is called a floating rate, because every few months, at the borrower's option, the interest rate is refixed. Now, how does this actually work? Where does the lead manager, agent bank, get its quotes? Well, for that you need to understand the structure behind the syndicated loan. Okay, so let's go and look at this from day one. There's your borrower, yeah? There's your syndicate. Day one, the borrower is required to ask the agent bank for a quote. It's in the book, by the way. It's all right, you can take a photograph, but it's also in the book, and you can color the page if you like. The borrower is required to ask the agent bank for an interest rate quote for the dollars it has borrowed. Let's say the borrower says, I'd like an interest rate for 3 months for dollars. Now, how does the syndicate banks get their interest rate quote? Answer, it depends on how the syndicate is funding itself. Now, supposing there's a pile of Japanese banks in here, they don't have dollars. They've got to get the dollars from somewhere else. Remember what I said? They go into the interbank market, borrow the dollars, and lend. Now remember, here's where the structural mechanics have to fit in. That's a 30-year syndicated loan. 30-year syndicated loan. So day one, there's a transfer of funds after conditions precedent are satisfied. Those funds are gone, 30 years. The borrower's obligation thereafter is to ask for interest rate quotes so that the borrower can be charged interest on the basis of LIBOR. So day one, it says, can you give me an interest rate quote for 3 months? How does the syndicate determine that amount? Well, the straight answer is because it is funding itself from the interbank market, it will go into the market, borrow for 3 months. The dollars that the Japanese banks are lending to the borrower. Now, that's it. They kiss goodbye to the funds in the borrower's hands. What happens next? Well, at the end of the 3 months, the Japanese banks have got to repay the dollars that they've got for 3 months back to the interbank market. They're not going to get it from the borrower because the borrower has got the funds for 30 years. So how do you do it? Answer, the syndicate needs to go back into the market and borrow to repay the first deposit or loan that they took for 3 months. Now, how do they know for what period they need to take funds from the market, which they're going to use to repay the first drawing? Answer, because of the interest rate clause. The borrower is required, remember, at the end of the first interest rate fixing period, chosen by it, this time, now example, 3 months, at the end of the 3 months, it must request another interest rate fix for a period of 3, 6, or 9 chosen by the borrower. So let's say at the end of the first 3 months it says, right, I'd like an interest rate fix for 6 months, please. How does the syndicate work this out? Well, it goes back into the market and borrows for 6 months, gets an interest rate from the market, the LIBOR rate, and then charges the borrower LIBOR plus the margin. And that's how it goes on for 30 years. The important thing in your head is the funds from the syndicate to the borrower move only once. There is only one transfer, no more. The rest is interest rate fixing. The interest rate is determined by the amount of time for which, the length of time for which the syndicate is taking funds from the interbank market. Do you see how it locks in now? If you're totally lost, say, I'm totally lost, I've got a clue what you're saying, that's fine. Yeah?
So there's a syndicate that's constantly reporting prior to the 30-year period?
Yeah, the syndicate is borrowing money or taking deposits, however you want to put it, from the market, getting an interest rate, which it pays the market, and the borrower gets that interest rate as LIBOR. But the period for which the banks, the syndicate, gets a deposit from the market with an interest rate attached to it by reference to LIBOR is determined by the interest rate period which the borrower has chosen for the next interest rate period. So if the borrower says 6 months, the banks will only get a deposit for 6 months with a LIBOR rate for 6 months. If the borrower says 9 months, that's what they will do. And at the end of the next interest rate period, the borrower is required under the terms of the SLA to come back and make another request for an interest rate period. And it says this time, 3 months only, please. Banks will go back into the market, take a deposit for 3 months. That LIBOR rate is what they will give the borrower. And this goes on for 30 years. If anybody has done banking at undergraduate or at business school, one of the things that you're taught is that banks should never lend long and borrow short. A $450 trillion market, however, works contrary to that basic principle, because they are borrowing short, 3 months, 6 months, 9 months, and lending for 30 years. Unsecured. The whole market works like this. Okay, moving on. So I hope you understood that. It's just how do you fix interest rates on a varying basis during the life of the loan, let's say a 30-year loan. And that's how it's done. Okay, now you've got to then think about the next issue that arises. Markets are volatile. Currency markets are volatile. And sometimes you can't get an interest rate from the market because the market is in massive disruption. Examples: collapse of Russia in 1989. Another example, 9/11. I hope you know what 9/11 is at least, even though you haven't heard about the LIBOR scandal. Anyone hasn't heard of 9/11? Okay, good. Okay. Yeah, none of us were alive at the time, but never mind. Markets get disrupted, and it may be that the banks, the syndicate banks, cannot get an interest rate quote in LIBOR for the period chosen by the borrower. What happens now? If you can't give an interest rate quote reference to LIBOR, the banks are in breach of the SLA. Therefore, there is a clause which deals with that scenario. If either due to absence of the relevant interest rate for the relevant period chosen by the borrower, or there is non-availability of funds in the interbank market, and therefore the banks cannot satisfy their obligation to give an interest rate quote by reference to LIBOR, the banks are given a right by this clause to provide an interest rate in an alternative currency for the period chosen by the borrower. So let's take an example where the borrower says, please give me an interest rate fix in yen for 3 months. There's massive disruption of the Tokyo global markets because a tsunami, an earthquake, the kind of thing that happens sometimes, unfortunately, in Japan. Markets are disrupted. Can't get a quote. The clause enables the syndicate banks to say, sorry, can't give you yen as you requested, but we can give you an alternative interest rate in dollars for that same period of time. The borrower is then required to accept the dollarized interest rate for the period chosen by the borrower because of this clause. However, the borrower is given an additional right that if it is unhappy with that way forward, it can repay all outstandings of the syndicated loan and end it there and then. So that's how this market disruption is dealt with by a special clause dealing with the interest rate fixed period. Then comes another problem with regard to the loans being made. In a syndicated loan, if you remember, 2 ways of doing it. One is, as I explained, a single transfer of all funds that the borrower is entitled to in one payment. Alternatively, it could be a revolving syndicated loan where the borrower has the power, the right under the syndicated loan agreement to borrow up to a specified maximum amount, repay some of it or all of it during the life of the loan, and then re-borrow some of it or all of it up to the maximum. In other words, an ongoing borrowing, repayment. In that structure, there is one problem that arises for the banks. What happens if it becomes illegal for one or more of the banks to make the loans? Here's a classic example. You've got a syndicated loan out to Gazprom, one of the largest global corporations located in Russia. Let's say you are a French or German bank and you're subject to French government sanctions if you lend to Russian corporations. What do you do now? You are now obligated under the syndicated loan agreement to lend the funds to Gazprom. If you do, you're subjected to sanctions by the French government. What's your position under the syndicated loan agreement, just so that you can lock it all in and understand it? Yes, you're going to be subject to French sanctions if you lend to Gazprom. But what's your position under the SLA? See, don't read, now think. How is it working under the SLA? Well, the SLA, remember, could be governed by English or New York law. Is the illegality by the place of incorporation of a bank relevant to its obligations under the SLA? You've already forgotten what we talked about last week. Okay? Go and have a go at thinking about it. What happens now? You're BNP Paribas. You're subject to sanctions by the French government if you continue lending or lend to Gazprom, a Russian corporation subject to French government sanctions. The SLA is governed by English law. Just take a simple example. What now? Can the French bank say, oh, that's it, French government says I can't go on lending to Gazprom, end of story, goodbye. Yeah?
Is it just because it's English law, the courts interpret it very strictly, so it will be, you're still obligated to pay it?
You've forgotten Article 3 of Rome already, and Article 9.3 of Rome already, because the law applicable into this scenario is what we've been talking about for the past 2 weeks. As far as the French bank is concerned, it's very simple. You've got the SLA, governing law, English law. What is its obligation? Answer to lend, continue lending. It cannot say, my government has said I can't lend, I'm going to be subject to sanctions. You've got to lend. Article 3, unless the place of payment is France, in which case the Article 9.3 rule kicks in. And BNP Paribas can say, euros are got to be paid in France by me to the borrower, and that's the law of the place of payment. The payment is illegal, therefore Article 9.3 kicks in, and that's the end of the matter. Now that may not happen all the time, and it could put banks into a very difficult situation and creates uncertainty in the SLA. Consequently, you got a clause which deals with this type of illegality to lend, not to borrow, to lend. Provides that if a bank or banks required to lend or under an obligation to lend comes under an obligation under its law of incorporation not to continue with the lending or to cease lending, that law will be recognized under the specific express terms of the SLA. That's called the illegal to lend clause. Now you've got to be careful about how this clause is drafted. Are you following me? I mean, I just get a feeling that you're completely lost. I'm talking Article 9.1, Article 9.3. Article 3.3 Rome, illegal to lend, blah, blah, blah. Are you following it or not? Because if you're not, for goodness sake, speak up. No, you're all following it. Very clear. Fantastic. Okay. Now, let me ask you a question then, if you're following it clear. Supposing the clause which says that if it becomes illegal for a bank or banks in this syndicated loan to lend funds to the borrower, they will be exempt, exonerated from that obligation to lend for the period of time when they are prohibited from lending. And you leave it at that. What's your analysis? That is the clause that we are talking about. If you look at the London Master Association's, London Market Association's Master Agreement, LMA clause, its clause reads, if it becomes illegal for a bank or banks in the syndicate to lend under applicable law, then the bank is exempt from lending. Now I'd like you to sit back, no reading because no one has written about it, and start thinking, how does this work? What determines applicable law? See what I said about those rules that we talked about in the first 2 weeks going right through the course? Here's another example. What is applicable law? Supposing you've got a, let's go be simple, the standard English law agreement, and it's drafted under LMA standard conditions. Illegal to lend by applicable law. How do you decide what is applicable law? It's the law of the place of payment. Who says it's the law of the place of performance, applicable law? You jumped 3 steps, but yeah, you're getting there. Who decides applicable law? What law determines applicable law? Parties. Shall I take you back into Rome 1 again? Yep. Have a look at Article 3. What does the governing law control? Go on, have a look at it. I told you, we're going to have to start behaving like lawyers. Turn the page, have a look at Article 3. What does it control? What does the governing law control? Okay, by the time you find it, I'll give you the answer. The interpretation of terms and phrases in a contractual document must be determined by the governing law. Right? So, in order to decide what is the meaning of the phrase applicable law, you've got to go right back to the governing law. Who says? Article 3, Rome. Therefore, you need to ask the question, how would English law determine what is the applicable law to illegality? Answer, Article 3 of Rome read with Article 9.3. So unless the illegality arises by the law of the place of performance, Article 9.3, it's irrelevant. So in the case of BNP Paribas, if the place of performance for yen is Tokyo, it cannot say, I'm subject to French sanctions, therefore I will not lend yen to Gazprom. Because by applicable law, Rome 1, Article 9.3, the sanctions have no application under the governing law and needs to be ignored. Okay, go away and think about it. I can see it. You're totally lost. If I was sitting in this class and I was totally lost, I wouldn't continue scratching my head. I would put my hand up and say, let me work out this logic. How does it work? And try to understand it. But if you're not going to do that, I will leave it for the seminars for you to come and think about it and ask again. Do you follow it at all? Or is it just one big jumble of rules all going all over the place? I'm not even going to get an answer to that one. Okay. Oh, one hand goes up at the back. Yes, please, what do you want to ask?
So, am I correct in saying that sanctions are just irrelevant unless it's Article 93 applies?
That's too much of a simplification. Never simplify. Let's go step by step. You can't say sanctions are irrelevant unless they are by the law of the place of incorporation. It depends on the drafting of this clause. Now, what I gave you was the LMA draft clause, not draft clause, it is the LMA clause. If it's illegal by the law of the place, if it's illegal by applicable law for a bank or banks to lend funds, then such bank or banks are exempt from lending. And I told you what the problem is with that drafting. It pulls in a governing law determination of what is applicable law under Article 3 of Rome. And if it's English law, or indeed New York law, the determination will be that sanctions from the place of incorporation are irrelevant. The only thing that's relevant is whether or not there's illegality by the law of the place of performance. End. So in summary, yes, you're right. But now, let's just look at this clause in a different context. Let's suppose, as some law firms are doing, they've dropped the LMA type of drafting and they said, if it's illegal to lend for any bank or banks by applicable law or by the law of the place of incorporation of that bank. Now how does it work? BNP Paribas subject to French sanctions. What do you guys do? You kind of switch your mind off and just copy things down. Think it through. What happens now? You've got a clause which says if it's illegal to lend by the law of the place of incorporation, and it's BNP Paribas subject to French sanctions. By the way, BNP Paribas, for those who don't know, is one of the major global banks. It's a French bank. Where are you? Oh, sorry, yeah. Why? Give me an analysis. Absolutely right. Good. At least someone is thinking this through. That's absolutely right. So I think what is important in this illegal to lend clause is to be very careful about what type of illegal to lend clause are we looking at. If it's the LMA clause, it's very restricted in application. It's essentially back to law of the place of performance. If it's illegal by the law of the place of performance to lend, the LMA clause works. If it's the clause that's used by some of the other global law firms, which refers not just to applicable law but the law of the place of incorporation, English law will recognize, or New York law will recognize, illegality by the law of the place of incorporation. And in our example, French bank, French government decree, place of incorporation France, the sanctions must be recognized under the SLA. Okay. One other means of dealing with this problem is to have a certification by the agent bank that a bank is subject to an illegality to lend, and that the agent bank's certification of such illegality is conclusive on all banks and the borrower, one way forward. So you can have different drafts, and there is no one magical draft. I think the safest one is to talk about illegality by applicable law or by the law of the place of incorporation of the bank in question. So that's the illegal to lend clause. We've talked about financial terms, and I'll just recap it. We've talked about revolving or term loans, and as I explained to you, the revolving loan is one where funds can be drawn down by a borrower, repaid and reborrowed for the life of the loan. In a term loan, the borrower can only borrow once, and then has to repay when the loan becomes due for repayment. You cannot repay and reborrow under the terms of a normal term loan. You then have a clause in that same provision saying that the purpose of the loan is X, Y, Z. Now you might ask, well, why do we have a purpose statement? It's usually very broad. It's the borrower shall use the funds for the purpose of working capital. The borrower shall use the funds for the purposes of investment in Brazil. The borrower shall use the funds for the reinvestment in, or whatever. Okay. There's a purpose statement. Two reasons for this clause. One is to avoid any problems with bank regulators who would say, hang on, why are you lending into the chemicals industry in Central America? Because we as a central bank have said you may not do that. So the purpose statement enables the banks to say what are they using, the borrower to say what is the borrower using the funds for, and therefore the banks can be clear about for what purpose they're making the loans. The second reason is the problem of illegality, not subsequent to lending, but ab initio, i.e. at the very beginning. Because if you make a loan of 1 billion to a pharmaceuticals company, for example, and those funds are used for cloning human beings in North Korea, most law systems prohibit that. It's illegal for the funds to be used for that purpose. Now, the purpose clause says you will use the funds for investment in South Korean nuclear reactors. That's fine. But the statement of the purpose to that effect, for the purpose of building nuclear reactors in South Korea, gives the banks a defense if the borrower actually uses the funds to invest in cloning of humans in North Korea. I'm not saying it happens, I'm merely taking an example. It's billion-dollar technology, so a billion-dollar loan would be necessary to achieve that. The reason why one is saying that is because if the governing law is English or New York law, if one party to a transaction, in this case a syndicated loan, is unaware that the other party is going to use the funds for an illegal purpose, the innocent party is not penalized. Otherwise, the entire loan is void because it's been used for an illegal purpose. To avoid that problem of void for illegality, ab initio, at the very beginning, you have a purpose clause. So the banks can say, well, I don't know what the hell you did with the funds. Maybe you were building hydrogen bombs in North Korea, but our purpose of lending to you was for you to build nuclear reactors in South Korea. So we're not responsible for what the heck you did. And therefore, the entire loan is not void. And if the borrower is in breach of that purpose statement, that purpose obligation, the banks can immediately start recovering their funds on the basis of default. Clear? It's all straightforward stuff, I hope. Okay. Yeah.
The money is actually used for an illegal purpose, and this is found out later on. Does this cause default?
The banks can have a right to call a default. Yeah. We'll come to that.
Also not do that.
If the banks decide not to, then they needn't call a default. But if, in our example, the funds that were loaned to a borrower for the purposes of building nuclear reactors for peaceful purposes in South Korea are then used for the development of human cloning in North Korea, what happens? The banks do not call a default. The banks then become responsible for waiving the obligations of the borrower in relation to the purpose provision, which means that the whole loan agreement becomes void. Right, okay, moving on. Financial terms. Other financial terms, not financial terms. There are three things that we need to think about. We talked about repayment in the currency of the borrowing. Now we're talking about prepayment. In every syndicated loan agreement, for however long, the borrower is given an unqualified right to repay loan outstandings at any time during the life of the loan, subject to a couple of qualifications. In other words, you can prepay the loan anytime, repay it at any time before it is due for repayment, subject to a couple of qualifications. The borrower wants to repay, it must repay only on an interest rate fixing date. Remember interest rate fixing date? Those are the dates on which the borrower needs to come and ask the syndicate banks for an interest rate quote by reference to LIBOR. And only on those dates can the borrower make a prepayment. Why is that? The reason is in here. If the banks have been borrowing for 6 months, in this example, and in the middle of that 6-month period, the borrower says, I'm exercising my right to prepay, what happens? The syndicate banks cannot return those funds into the market. It's left with $1 billion on its hands for 6 months, for which it is paying interest into the interbank market. Thus, the clause which says you may not repay except on an interest rate fixing date. So as soon as the funds come in on an interest rate fixing date, the banks can simply hand it back to the depositors in the markets. That's why the requirement that you will only prepay a loan prior to maturity on an interest rate fixing date. Now, in the case of a revolving syndicated loan agreement, the obligation is either to prepay on an interest rate fixing date or on the date on which the actual loan becomes due for repayment. Because you're borrowing in a revolver, if you remember, for periods of time, say 1 year, 2 years, and then re-borrow again for whatever period of time you want. So in a revolver, the requirement is to prepay only on dates on which the loans become due for repayment. Now, if you don't comply with that requirement of prepay on an interest rate fixing date, you get caught by something called the break funding clause. The break funding clause provides that if the borrower exercises its option to prepay loan funds prior to an interest rate fixing date and during an interest rate period, the borrower will pay to the banks break funding costs as determined by the agent bank. What the hell are break funding costs? Answer, it's there. What we were talking about 2 minutes ago. Borrower prepays $1 billion back to the syndicate in the middle of the 6-month interest rate period. It's now the syndicate cannot return those funds to the depositors because they've taken the funds for 6 months. They might take it back if they pay something additional fees. That is what the borrower is then required to pay as break funding costs. The loss to the banks of receiving the funds during an interest rate period. You see how detailed this whole thing is. You know, whenever we do this, you find people from other countries saying, oh, it's all in the code. Yeah? Any of this? No, you've got to have specific clauses to deal with specific things that keep coming up. And why is this important? Because this gives absolute certainty to what happens in every possible scenario that can happen. And that's why Clifford Chance and Linklaters get paid the salaries they get paid. To get it right, to be precise, to cover every possible scenario as precisely as you can. You're not relying on statute, you're not relying on some outdated code, you're relying on now drafted clauses. And that's the purpose of the whole structure. Okay, now, we're going to deal with one legal principle which kicks in at this point. Most law systems, including New York law, English law, and many other law systems, have a doctrine called the penalty doctrine. The penalty doctrine in most law systems says, if there's a breach of a contract, and there is a clause in that contract saying, if you breach the contract, you will pay X. by way of damages to the innocent party. The penalty doctrine says that if that amount specified in the contractual document exceeds or far exceeds the actual damage suffered by the innocent party, then that clause requiring damages payment is a penalty and shall be void. Important point, that doctrine applies when there is an actual breach of a contractual document. Now look at your SLA. It's saying you will pay the following costs to us, but is there a breach of anything? The borrower is given an unqualified right to prepay. Nobody is breaching anything. No breach, no penalty doctrine. And so, although there is a rule which we need to remember as background, the prepayment clause is not breached when the borrower says, sure, I'm going to prepay now. There's no breach of the contractual terms. It's subject to things like you pay break funding costs, you can only pay on an interest rate fixing date, and if you don't, then you pay these costs. Therefore, in the SLA, there is a clause which requires the borrower to make what is called a prepayment premium, i.e. additional funds to be made payable to the syndicate banks, in addition to break funding costs. A prepayment premium needs to be paid. It's that premium that can be attacked on the basis of a penalty. And I'll explain the logic as to why it's not. Because the penalty doctrine in most law systems, including English and New York law, don't bother reading the cases. I gave them to you just in case some of you like to read cases. It's clear that the doctrine applies, the penalty doctrine applies only if there is a breach. There is no breach because the prepayment is permitted. Therefore, whatever you're required to pay on prepayment cannot be a penalty. But there is a premium payable by the borrower on prepayment. Right, okay, there's the various quotes from the judgments as to why not. Okay, let's ignore the cases and the judges and just move on to something else. The next clause that's relevant, the withholding tax gross-up clause. The withholding tax gross-up clause, you don't have to be a tax lawyer to understand it, provides as follows. If the borrower becomes subject to a tax regulation in its home jurisdiction after the signing of the loan agreement, which requires the borrower to pay to the local revenue in the borrower's country a percentage of the interest which it is going to pay to banks overseas in the syndicate. That's called a withholding tax. You'll pay to the taxman 10% of the interest which you're about to pay Deutsche Bank and Nomura. That's a withholding tax. Now, usually, before a syndicated loan agreement is signed, this would be checked out by tax lawyers as to whether or not there's a withholding tax applicable at the date of signature of the syndicated loan. The problem arises later. If the withholding tax is imposed on the borrower by the borrower's tax authorities after the syndicated loan agreement is signed, what happens now? Well, the withholding tax gross-up clause deals with it. It says if you, borrower, become subject to a withholding of the interest you're going to pay us, and you've got to withhold a certain percentage of that interest and give it to the taxman by way of a tax, then you are required to gross up the interest payable to us so that we get the full LIBOR plus interest payable to us. We don't care whether you've got to pay another 10% to the taxman. Essentially, the borrower ends up paying twice. 10% to the taxman, another 10% under the withholding tax gross-up clause. The borrower is, of course, given, where am I? Yeah. The borrower is, of course, given the option that if it's not prepared to gross up under the withholding tax gross up clause, it may prepay the loan. It's the borrower's alternative route. If it says, no, I don't want to pay 10% to my tax man and 10% to you guys by way of grossing up, which means in that case, please prepay. Okay, so that's the withholding tax gross up clause. Yeah, sure, anytime.
Gross up clause is prohibited under the law of the place.
Run that one again. If the withholding tax gross up clause is prohibited under the borrower's jurisdiction. Sorry? Absolutely. You're back to square one. What law controls it? Answer. Rome I rules, at least in Europe and elsewhere, the recognition rules of a governing law. The governing law controls. Question, does the governing law recognize the tax gross up illegality by the law of the place of incorporation? Answer, no. Yep, okay. Thank you. I'm glad you're thinking it through and you're tying in the Rome stuff into these discussions, because they are completely interlinked. Okay, next one, which is reasonably similar, is the increased funding costs clause. Earlier you were talking about the borrower being required by its tax authorities to make a withhold on the interest it's paying to the banks. This time we are talking about the banks becoming subject to regulation in their home state after the syndicated loan agreement is signed, which increases the cost of funding to that bank, the cost of funding the syndicated loan. So, to give you an example, if a central bank of a country provides that all its banks incorporated in that jurisdiction shall make a payment to the central bank of X% of loans made in dollars to entities from certain specified countries. A bank in the syndicate or two banks in the syndicate would now have its costs being increased because of the amounts they've got to pay the central bank. But the best example of increased costs is to be found in the Basel regulations, which are applicable to all banks across the globe, not because of Basel, but because Basel regulations are implemented by central banks across the globe. How many of you come across Basel? Or BAL, if you want to use the French pronunciation. You have. Are you doing a course which covers it, a module which covers it? Sorry? Banking law, okay. Now what BAL does, or Basel does, is to say that in relation to bank lending activity, banks' portfolios of assets, it will maintain on its balance sheet, by way of equity and reserves, a certain percentage in relation to what are known as risk assets, or to use the technical term, risk-weighted assets under Basel. You don't have to go into Basel, that's all you need to know. If, as a result of the lending, the risk-weighted assets of a bank in the syndicate is changed by its central bank regulator, requiring that bank to increase its capital, its equity, in itself, that's an increased cost to that bank in maintaining or lending or making this loan. The increased funding cost clause provides that if there is such an increase in the cost of making the loan to any member of the syndicate, the borrower shall make good that increased cost. Now you can imagine the reaction of most borrowers. It's like hell. Why would I want to pay you the cost of your bad lending decisions? So it is something that's argued for literally hours about whether or not Basel risk-based capital requirements should be included or excluded in the increased funding costs clause. As a lawyer, you couldn't care less. You fall asleep, you wake up and say, oh, so what have you guys decided at 3 o'clock in the morning? And if they say, oh, we've decided to exclude it, you exclude it. That's it. You're done. But it is something that is part of the discussion in a syndicated loan agreement, the increased funding costs clause. Usually, I think most borrowers will insist that increased costs of funding due to Basel capital requirements will not be part of the increased costs clause. Okay. Moving on. Financial term, more financial terms. Fees and commissions. This is why I said it's the most important part of the syndicated loan agreement to the banks. Now, you know that the borrower is required to pay LIBOR plus a margin, interest rate plus margin. The margin is the profit for the syndicate banks. On top of that, the borrower is obligated to make a number of other payments. First of all, it's required to pay management fees to the managers or co-managers, so-called in the syndicated loan agreement. Syndicated loan agreement will say the managers of the syndicated loan are, boom, 10 banks, specified. I don't know what they manage, but they are called managers. And they are required to be paid management fees by the borrower. And the borrower shall pay management fees of X% to the manager. Then a commission is to be paid to the lead manager for arranging the entire syndicated loan. That's the lead manager's commission, on top of the management fees payable. And on top of that, as I think I mentioned a couple of weeks ago, the lead manager is paid something else called a praecipium or praecipium, which is just Latin for fees or commissions. So those are the fees and commissions paid. But it is important to just to appreciate what this is, because if you've got a syndicate of 200 banks, what you earn in that syndicated loan, clearly the margin on top of LIBOR, yes. But what else? The what else depends on your status within the hierarchy of banks. If you reach manager level, then you're collecting quite a bit of money by way of commission. If you're a lead manager, of course, you get more and more money in terms of by way of commissions for arranging the syndicated loan and for being the lead manager. So there is an importance attached to it by the banks, if not anybody else. Yeah, okay, back to go.
This on the praecipia, what's actually in it? So you say it's Latin fee, but what's actually covered if the manager's obligated commission?
It's just a praecipium. You'd be amazed how many people say, okay, these are the fees. And at the meeting, they read out management fees, X%, blah, blah, blah. Everyone says, yeah, okay. Commission to the lead manager for arranging the syndicated loan. Yeah, so much percentage. Okay, done. And then thirdly, the praecipium payable to the lead manager as usual. Nobody says, what the hell is a praecipium as usual? It's all agreed without any argument. You'd be amazed when you start this. Yeah, I made the mistake once of asking that when I was a junior associate. What is the praecipium? And my partner's response was, so there it is. It's still payable. Sorry, did you want to know what the meaning of the word is? The word is very simple.
No, I genuinely wanted.
Sorry?
No, I just wasn't genuinely.
Well, I mean, let's put it this way. I mean, the lead manager, as agent bank, does perform a number of functions. And therefore, while the commission for arranging the syndicated loan is one type of activity for which the lead manager is being paid, it's then got to be paid further fees for acting as agent bank. For example, certifying that the conditions precedent have been satisfied and therefore funds can be loaned. So there are functions which it does perform. So in a sense, the additional fee can be justified. Oh, yeah.
Are these commission paid upfront?
Yes, upfront. Yeah. Still awake? Still following? Yeah. Thank you for raising that. The answer is yes, and I didn't mention it when I was talking about revolving loans, and I should. I should have. If the loan, the syndicated loan, is a revolving syndicated loan, that is to say the borrower has a right to borrow up to a specified maximum in a range of specified currencies. It has a right to borrow whatever amount it wants in any currency that is specified, up to the specified amount, not the whole amount, but up to any amount that it wants, then repay and reborrow. Because of that feature, the loan may not be fully utilized as a term loan would be, because on day one in a term loan, all the funds are transferred to the borrower. In a revolving loan, not all the funds are transferred. In fact, in practice, maybe 25%, 30%, 40%, no more than that. And then it's maybe borrowed again or repaid and reborrowed. So there is a, right through the life of the revolving loan, there is a period of time, ongoing, where the full amount of the loan is not made to the borrower. It has a right to borrow, but it hasn't borrowed. So what the banks then provide in terms of fee structure is what you raised. The borrower is required to pay a commitment fee in relation to funds not borrowed, in return for the banks being ready and willing to lend that amount ongoing. It's a commitment fee that the borrower is required to pay in order to ensure that the banks continue to be willing to lend ongoing. The commitment fee is calculated by reference to the unutilized, unborrowed portion of the loan, of the revolving loan. Clear? Yeah. Okay. Sorry, I should have mentioned that when I'm talking about revolving loans. Right, so those are the financial terms of the SLA. We're now getting on to the covenants in the syndicated loan agreement. There are 6 key covenants, and the first one, after which the banks leave the meeting, are the financial covenants, followed by something called information covenants, followed by asset disposal covenants, the negative pledge covenant, the merger control covenant, and the pari passu covenant. And this is simply covenants applicable to the borrower. There are other clauses applicable to the agent bank and so on. We'll come to that later. This is simply those applicable to the borrower. The first and most important one from the banker's point of view are the financial covenants. And I want to try and explain this before I tell you what they are. Okay, let me tell you what they are. Just a list for the moment, okay? There are 5 key covenants. One is called the debt to equity ratio covenant. The next one is the minimum net worth covenant. Next is the current ratio covenant, the minimum working capital covenant, and the debt service ratio covenant. Now, this stuff is not for us. This is, you let them argue with each other and you say, have you decided what the hell is the debt to equity ratio you want? 2 to 1? Okay, done. But it's useful to know what the heck they are talking about. If somebody turns around and says, do you have a view on this? You can sound a little bit knowledgeable if you say, yeah, I think in the last syndicated loan we did, we had 1.5 to 1 on the debt to equity ratio, blah, blah, blah. But, and that was a comparable borrower. But it isn't a matter for lawyers. And believe me, you shouldn't be involved and should not be involved. And if you do open your mouth on the subject and you're sitting next to a partner, he or she will say, shush, we're not involved. I don't want liability on my balance sheet by talking out of turn. It's entirely a matter for the syndicate banks. But I think we need to understand what they are. First, let's understand the logic of these financial control covenants. Remember that all syndicated lending in the market, other than in project finance, is unsecured. No asset security. Because of that feature, the banks have developed a set of what we call control covenants. These are covenants which require the borrower to achieve certain levels, certain standards of business and financial performance right through the life of the loan. They're not intended to be ratios which actually say, oops, the borrower is going to be in serious trouble. Not at all. That's too late. What these covenants do is to require the borrower to perform financially and in business at a level which satisfies these ratios so that the banks are comfortable that this borrower is going swimmingly, as we say, or doing well. So these are doing well covenants, not red flag covenants. So let's try and understand how they work. For that, you need to understand just the basics of a corporate balance sheet. Don't worry, it's about the last time you'll ever look at it. Just to understand how this thing works. Every corporation, anywhere on the globe, has a balance sheet as its most important financial statement. It's also got something else called profit and loss statement, which is a separate one which deals with its revenues, its costs, and so on. What we're looking at is the balance sheet. In other words, this is a financial snapshot at a given point in time, usually end of the year, of that corporation's financial position. The balance sheet is actually divided into two segments, the asset side and the liability side. And then there is the current side of the assets section, the current side of the liability section, and the long-term side of the asset section and the long-term side of the liability section. Now, I'm sure those of you are awake, as lawyers, as I did, you must be wondering, hang on, its equity and its profit reserves are a liability? How come? Why is it ranked alongside bank debt? Cross your mind or you couldn't care less. Okay, in which case I won't tell you. You want to know why it is? Can anyone guess why it is there?
Assets minus the liabilities.
Agreed, but why is it a liability?
Because it's a debt of the company to the shareholder.
Absolutely right. Accountants see equity, the shares in the company, and the profits as being amounts owed to its shareholders by the company, just as bank debt is owed to banks. Therefore, it becomes a liability. That's a very strange way of looking at it, because the rest of us, the greater the equity, the greater the capital reserve, the stronger the company is. So, but anyway, that is. That's how it works. Now let's look at how these ratios work in relation to this little balance sheet. By the way, another little thing that you need to remember, and accountants will tell you, the amount of assets on a balance sheet must equal exactly the liabilities on a balance sheet, otherwise the company is bankrupt. Yeah? Very simple, basic accounting principle. So what are we going to look at? Debt to equity ratio first. What it would say is that the borrower shall maintain at all times during the life of the loan a ratio of, take your pick, 1.5 to 1 or 2 to 1 in respect of its debt to its equity. Now, that ratio, whether it's 2 to 1, 1.5 to 1, or whatever, is not for us, it's for the banks. So what's our job? Our job is to give a definition to what the heck is debt and what the heck is equity. Let's go back. Debt can be defined, and that again depends on how banks want it defined. Do they want debt to be defined as by reference only to bank debt, or is it all liabilities? That's something for them, not for us. Usually it's bank debt, but not necessarily. So the second thing that we have to define is what is equity and profit reserves. Shareholder shares and profits in the company. That's the so-called equity and profit reserve. Now, but you've got to define it. Now, sometimes some people try so hard, having read 300 books, to try and define equity and to define what is meant by debt and so on. There's a much shorter way of doing it, a practical way of doing it. There it is. You want to define it, you say debt shall mean all borrowings, debt stated on the balance sheet and accounts as ordered by Pricewaterhouse. So you don't get into trying to work out what the heck it is. You say as specified by, have I put Ernst & Young, yeah, for Pricewaterhouse, whoever, on the company's published report and accounts. The same with equity. Equity shall mean all such amounts specified as share capital and reserves on the accounts of the borrower as specified by Pricewaterhouse. Stop. You don't get into the endless argy-bargy about what is equity, what is not equity, blah, blah, blah. You'll be there till the end of the year trying to work that one out. So you don't. You adopt a far more practical approach to the definition. So that's how we define debt and equity. Now, you then need to understand, well, what is the purpose of this clause saying debt to equity ratio shall be 1.5 to 1. 1.5 of debt to 1 of equity, or 2 of debt to 1 of equity. The reason is very straightforward. It seeks to control borrowers' future borrowings. You borrow too much, you'll be in breach of that debt to equity ratio. So the companies or the corporations' activities need to be funded from profits rather than more and more borrowing. That's the purpose of that ratio. It must continue being a highly profitable corporate entity. Otherwise, it goes into breach of the debt to equity ratio. Now, same point I made earlier, the ratio is set at a very a level which is comfortable for the banks, and it's not a red flag. It's not something that indicates, oh my God, this corporation is going to get into difficulty. It's set by banks at what they consider to be a comfort level. Now, then we've got something else called minimum net worth. Now, this is not a ratio, it's an absolute number. Borrower shall at all times maintain a minimum net worth of so much, $1 billion. They're always in billions because these are the Microsofts, they are the Hyundais, the Daimler-Benzes, and the Exxon Mobils. You got the same question, how do you define it? What is minimum net worth? Well, okay, that is, you do the same thing. Minimum net worth shall mean the sum of the borrower's share capital, profits and reserves, as stated by the appointed auditors, Pricewaterhouse, in the audited accounts of the borrower. You do not get into the debate about what is and what is not. You throw it right back at the accountants and their definition in the balance sheet of the borrower. But the more important question is, why do we have a minimum net worth covenant? It's not for you again, but I think a basic working understanding would be helpful. The purpose of the minimum net worth covenant is to prevent the borrower gaming the debt to equity ratio covenant. Let's take an example and see how this works. Let's say syndicate banks have said your debt to equity ratio shall at all times be 2 to 1. Bank borrowings shall not exceed twice your net worth of 1. So let's give that some figures. Let's say the assets are 600, left side of the balance sheet. On the right side of the balance sheet, there's 400 of bank debt and other debt, and 200 of equity. It gives you 600 on both sides, right? Now, let's assume for 2 years, the borrower makes losses at 20 each year, amounting to 40 for the 2 years. Even you and I can, I think, work that one out. You don't be an accountant. What happens now? The new position on the balance sheet, assets still remain 600, but the debt side, equity has gone down by 40 because that's where the profit, that's where the losses hit. That's where the losses are suffered in equity and profits. Now remember that rule, assets must equal liabilities. How would you fund that 40 loss in equity? Answer, you borrow more. 440, borrow 40 to cover this loss. So you've still got 600 there and 600 here. But something has happened. The debt to equity ratio is now shot up to 2.8. It's a breach of a 2.1, 2 to 1 debt to equity ratio. Now, what the borrower can do, and borrowers usually do, is when they see the debt to equity ratio rising slowly towards breach level, they start selling assets. You sell assets and you reduce your debt from the funds that you get by selling assets. So, if you sell assets and you reduce your debt, you sell your assets from 600 to 480, 120 of assets, $120 million of assets. And you pay down your borrowings by 120 from 440 to 320, what have you got? A perfect 2-to-1 again. And the banks know that. That's gaming the system. Yeah.
Can you do like a new issue, like issue more shares, even like to even it out?
Sure, they can issue more shares, but how many people want to buy shares in a company whose financial performance is going southwards
They did it in with the Norwegian airline company.
when it was going bust?
No, it was, or it wasn't breaching the contract because it was stated that they had to have, I think, some 150 million pounds in equity at all times, and they went below that, and they just issued up.
Sure, if you've got a minimum net worth requirement, it will mean one thing: the borrower cannot sell assets and pay down debt if it's not performing well. If it needs to maintain its minimum net worth at a particular point, and in this example, if minimum net worth covenant said you will maintain at all times 500 of shares and profit reserves, it would be in breach. But the point I'm making is that yes, of course, as you said, the borrower can go into the markets and raise equity, shares, and improve its minimum net worth. But the purpose of the minimum net worth clause is not simply for it to go off and increase its net worth, but it's to prevent this being done. Asset liquidation and paying down of debt, with the debt to equity ratio being perfect. Can't be. And that's what banks are trying to prevent. Yeah.
Is that net worth percent, is that a red flag or is that still?
Oh, no, that's never, none of these are fixed at a red flag level. Absolutely not. No ratio is fixed at a red flag level. It's fixed at, sorry, does everyone know what the phrase, it's at red flag level? There you go. Why don't you ask me? Because you're now shaking your head and thinking, that's okay, and you go home and think, what the hell is a red flag? It's danger level. Red flag, you know, when you go swimming in the sea, usually on the beach there's a blue flag, a yellow flag, or a red flag. The French are very good at this. All their beaches, they've got blue flag, yellow flag, red flag. Red flag means danger. So that's why we say, is it at red flag level? No, it's not. Not even at yellow flag level. These are at perfectly comfortable level, i.e. the corporation is performing well. Right, okay. Current ratio. I just need you to have a working understanding of it, so that's about all that's required. The current ratio measures the current side of the assets with the current side of the liabilities. What are current assets? Example, bank deposits. Payments due from debtors in the next 6 months. They're all current assets. On the liability side, what are current liabilities? Repayments on loans, interest payments on loans coming up within the year. What this ratio says is you will maintain at all times a ratio between the current assets and current liabilities of 1-to-1. Usually that's the ratio that banks require in practice. So that's about all you need to know. How do you define current assets? Same way you define net worth, same way you define debt. Throw it straight into the prepared audited accounts of the borrower, audited by Pricewaterhouse or whoever it is. There's a similar covenant to the minimum net worth covenant, the minimum current assets covenant, and to ensure that the borrower does not pay down its liabilities by selling off current assets. The last one that I'm going to talk about, and this is not all there is in terms of ratios and stuff like that, but just for our benefit, understanding, these are the main covenants that you will come across. The debt service ratio. Now, the debt service ratio does not focus on the balance sheet, it focuses on the profit and loss statement. Every corporation has a profit and loss statement. How much did it make in the year by way of revenues, the sales, what were its costs, and what were the resulting profits. And then, of course, interest payments due to banks, taxes due to HMRC or whoever the revenue authority is. The debt service cover ratio focuses on that part of the financial statement of the borrower, its revenue statement. The purpose of this ratio is to require that the borrower maintains enough revenues on an ongoing yearly basis to be able to pay all interest and principal that falls due within that year. That's the purpose of requiring a debt service ratio. What does it say? What it says is that the borrower shall maintain at all times a debt service ratio of EBIT, earnings before interest and tax, EBIT, the accountant's phrase, EBIT. 2, the debt service costs, the DS costs. What are DS costs? Answer, the amount payable by way of interest and repayments of principal on all debt of the borrower. So that's the ratio you're looking at. Earnings before interest and tax compared with its obligations that year to have made interest payments and principal repayments on all its loans. The purpose of this clause, requirement, ratio is essentially to ensure that the borrower is generating enough cash and profits to be able to pay, use the banker's term, service, interest and principal repayments due that year. And those are the main covenants that you'll expect to come across, and that's about all you really need to know about it. You're not going to get involved in the negotiation of these covenants. You're not going to be giving advice to the banks. Please don't give any advice unless you want your firm to become liable in a few $1 million about these covenants and the levels at which they ought to be set. They are purely in the realm of and in the control of the banks. It's one of the things that I know it's difficult for many people who have done law degrees in jurisdictions where you mix up law, economics, finance, accounting, blah, 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 the whole works, to get into this world and be told, you're a lawyer. Stop. You're not an accountant. Because for that, there are Price Waterhouse. You're not an economist. So please do not talk about things on which you have absolutely no or little expertise. And that's something I'm sure you will learn as you go into the markets. You don't talk about things on which you do not have real expertise. You don't go into a Morgan Stanley or a meeting with ExxonMobil and give them advice on their ratios. You're being paid not for the ratios, because for that, there are guys with PhDs in mathematics. In the same way that the accountants are not going to be asked, how do you think we ought to phrase this clause relating to increased funding costs? Not their expertise. They may have heard about it, but there is no way they will be asked to comment on it. Similarly, you will not be asked and should not be commenting. It's a very important practical aspect of lawyering in these markets. Each of us will have a specialized niche expertise, and that's where we stay. Not economics, not accounting, not financial engineering, law. You get paid for it a lot, but you need to know where your limits are. And the reason I mention it is I know that unlike places in America and here, that there is this very sharp divide between you're a lawyer, those are accountants. That's not encouraged in other jurisdictions. I don't know which ones, but there's a general tendency to mix law, accounting, economics, blah, yada, yada, financial engineering, the whole works. And you think you know about it all. The answer is you don't. You know little about everything, and it's dangerous. Anyway, sorry, your comment.
But you still have to draft this clause.
Sorry?
You still have to draft it.
You have to draft the clause, but
Give you the term sheet and says the numbers, you still need to know what it is.
absolutely, and that's why I said you need a basic understanding. What you are not going to do and shouldn't be doing is advising on those numbers, what those numbers are. Or to say, well, I think the debt to equity ratio should be higher, or according to this profit and loss statements, with these EBITs, earnings before interest and tax, then the debt service ratio should be X. Gosh, no. That is not something we ought to be doing. It's dangerous. And I'm saying this to you because I know that from the point of view of legal cultures, this divide isn't as hard and sharp in some jurisdictions as the markets want to see it. The Nomuras, the Deutsches, the Goldman Sachses, the ExxonMobils, they see this distinction very sharply. And when you go there, you're being paid as a lawyer and you need to be nothing more than that. Just as Price Waterhouse will be nothing more than accountants. That's just as the mathematicians calculating these ratios and covenants will do nothing more than that, because the level of expertise required to operate in these markets is extremely high. You cannot be a layman dabbling, knowing the basics of something else. Can't do it. It's dangerous. Anyway, okay, let's move on. Have you had enough for today? I'm going to finish off with this one, okay? This is very easy to understand. The information covenant. Now, the information covenant is actually one which enables the banks to monitor whether or not a borrower is complying with those covenants that you've just gone through, the financial ratio covenants. I mean, how do you know that the borrower is complying with a debt-to-equity ratio covenant ongoing? The report and accounts are published at the end of the year, once a year. Some borrowers do it semi-annually, but mostly it's annual. So what happens in the middle? How do you know that a borrower is complying with its debt-to-equity ratio covenants? Answer, if the banks want to know what it is, that covenant enables the agent bank on behalf of the syndicate to ask for such information. But the clause actually is wider. It simply says borrower is required to make available all reporting accounts, annual, semi-annual, and otherwise. But the sting is in the next line. The agent bank on behalf of the banks has power to ask for any additional information from the borrower, and the borrower shall provide such information within X number of days. It is a key provision when the borrower is not doing terribly well. But if you think about it, it's a 30-year loan. Who knows what a borrower is going to be like in 20 years? So if you're not sure what's going on, an agent bank acting on behalf of the syndicate can demand information, financial, business, and otherwise, from the borrower at any point in time, without waiting for the report and accounts or anything of that sort. So that's the information covenant. It's a very useful covenant. It's a very important covenant from a practical point of view. Okay, I'm not going to go into asset. These are more detailed covenants. As I said, by now the investment bankers are all gone, and leaving us lawyers to sort out the legal stuff, as they call it, which is what I'm going to get onto next week. But shall we end there? I think you've had enough for the day. Okay. Whoa. Any questions, please ask from there. Because I'd like you to get into the habit of asking questions from the floor. And secondly, not to discuss your dinner plans, cocktail plans, until your colleagues have finished asking their questions. Can we try that? Because it's quite rude to interrupt when someone is trying to ask a question. No, that message is not going through. Like I said, it's rude to interrupt your colleagues when they're trying to ask a question by a discussion of your Facebook or Instagram page that you're looking at. Yeah, please.
So before you mentioned something about a negative pledge, but at the beginning of the course you mentioned that most transactions that we would be dealing with are unsecured. Therefore, I don't see how a negative pledge could play into that scenario.
I'm going to go through all of those covenants starting next week. So you can leave the question for next week if you like. What's a negative pledge? I'm going to explain that in great detail.
No, I know what it means.
Okay.
I don't see how it applies to an unsecured loan, though, because it guarantees that you will rank high with respect to.
Oh my goodness, you've got a completely misunderstood version of the negative pledge clause. So So wait for the discussion, and then we can talk about it. Somebody else had a question here somewhere here. Oh yeah, please. Yeah.
In the interest of the rate fixing clause, if the borrower fails to request quotes, is that an immediate default?
Can you guys hear what he's saying? Or can you simply hear the Instagram discussion? Yeah, go ahead, please.
Sorry. In the interest of rate fixing clause, if the borrower fails to request a quote from the agent bank, is that an immediate default, or there are any other consequences?
If the borrower fails to,
Yes, I mean, he requested a quote for 3 months, and then at the end of that period, he does nothing.
failure by the borrower to make an interest rate fix is a breach of its obligations under the SLA. And we'll come to it in a short while. Any breach of any covenant of any term in the SLA gives rise to an immediate default.
So the lead manager cannot set forth the interest rate.
I'm sorry, I can't hear you. You want to speak up?
Sorry. So the lead manager cannot, on its own initiative, set forth the interest rate.
No, the process set out in the SLA, which must be complied with, otherwise there's a breach of obligation, is that the borrower needs to ask for an interest rate fix by sending a note saying, or email or telephone call saying, I need you to give me a LIBOR rate for 3 months, which is the period which I've chosen under clause 41 1.1b. Only then. Till then, the syndicate lead manager, agent bank, need not do anything. Secondly, if the borrower fails, which was your question, I think, the borrower is in breach of its obligations to fix the interest rate. And there is a default, technical default. And if banks want to exercise it, they can say default. Not that they will, generally speaking in practice, but it is technically a default scenario. Right, anything else, or can we, yeah?
I got a question for the Easter payments for the year.
Yep.
I totally got lost in there.
Good. I'm glad you're raising it. Why didn't you put your hand up when I was talking about prepayments? Okay. The borrower in a syndicated loan agreement has an obligation. I haven't yet come to the repayment clause, but let's just deal with it. The repayment is required, as I said, in the currency of the borrowing. Okay? The repayment is required at the end of the period of the loan. Now, the borrower, however, during the life of the loan, let's, for an example, say it's 30 years, during that period, it is given an express right by an express clause, enabling the borrower to prepay all loans that it has borrowed before they become due for repayment. That's the prepayment power, the prepayment right. That is unqualified, subject to 2 conditions. One is that any prepayment must be made and can only be made on an interest rate fixing date, i.e. the next interest rate fixing date. If you do it at any other time, the borrower is then subject to the break funding costs clause, i.e. that any damage or loss suffered by the bank because of the borrower repaying the loan in the middle of an interest rate period shall be paid for by the borrower to the syndicate banks by way of break funding costs. The amount to be determined by the agent bank. Was there something else that you wanted to think about in the context of prepayment? I think I discussed a legal principle which is potentially applicable. The reason why the principle that is common to most law systems is called the penalty doctrine. And why is that relevant to us? Because on a prepayment being made by the borrower, it is required to make an additional payment to the syndicate called a prepayment premium. for the privilege of prepaying the loans before repayment, actual repayment date. It's a power, it's a right that they have to do it, but it's subject to a premium. Now, the penalty doctrine comes in because if such a payment is required when there's a breach of a contractual provision, both under English law and New York law, and I believe under most law systems that we are familiar with, that payment required on a breach, payment on breach, is subject to the penalty doctrine. Penalty doctrine says if the payment required is far greater than the loss that the innocent party has suffered, then that requirement is void. That's the penalty doctrine. Now, how does this work in the context of what we're talking about? Well, it doesn't apply, because the prepayment premium is not payable upon a breach. The prepayment premium is payable when the borrower exercises its unqualified power to prepay at any time on an interest payment date. Agreed? Done. Anybody else wants any questions, details, answers? Yeah, please do. Do you want to speak up a bit so that everybody can hear? Okay, legality to lend clause. Sorry, what did you want to ask about it? Okay. If it becomes unlawful for a bank to lend usually by the law of the place of its regulator or place of incorporation, it cannot say, I'm sorry, I can't lend if I'm BNP Paribas, for example, because the French government has said, no, you're not going to lend to Russian corporations. You can't use that. Why? Because the governing law determines that your obligations are controlled by the governing law and the governing law alone, unless it's illegal by the law of the place of performance, Article 9.3. So if you're BNP Paribas with an obligation to make a yen payment, a payment in yen, a loan in yen, to Gazprom in Tokyo under a syndicated loan agreement, the illegality is not by the law of the place of performance. Therefore, applying Article 3 of Rome, the governing law says the French decree is irrelevant. Therefore, that problem people have tried to solve by including an illegal to lend express clause, saying if it becomes illegal to lend by applicable law, then the bank is exempt from its obligation, released from its obligation to lend. The point I made was that unless that clause is carefully drafted, it may not work. Why? Because if you have, for example, the LMA format, which says if it's illegal to lend for any bank or banks by applicable law, then the bank is exempt from lending. The problem with that formula is that the phrase by applicable law, illegal by applicable law, has also got to be interpreted. By what law? Answer, by governing law. Who says Article 3 of Rome? So you've got to ask, what is the applicable law by reference to interpretation rules of the governing law? Now, the governing law says applicable law is only the governing law plus the law of the place of performance, end of story. That's why the better draft is to refer to illegality by applicable law or by the law of the place of incorporation. Because if you got that formula, then my example of BNP Paribas being subject to French prohibition of lending whatever currency in Tokyo to Russian entities is overcome. Okay, are we done, or do we have any other questions? Oh, you got a question. Go ahead, please.
Are you able to finance too much?
Am I able? I am not offering it. I think I've got to tell you guys, and I said 2 weeks. And I said that a couple of weeks ago, so. Yeah. I will let you know, hopefully by next week. Are you hoping to do it? The only drawback, and the reason why it's been delayed, is because the person who has agreed to do the darn thing is basically saying, I'm not going to mark 100 scripts. And that means, once more, we might be subject to a cap. So I'm trying to sort that one out. So give me some time. Understood. Tuesday, could you come in Wednesday?